And when I look at, the sort of highly processed foods that now dominate our food environment, people know they're not good for them. They know they have diabetes. They know they're having heart disease and sleep apnea. They want to cut down on them. And they find that those foods feel so irresistible. The cravings are so potent. Once they start eating them, they find they can't stop. That it's much like how we saw with addictions with cigarettes.
Hello, spot on listeners. Today it's all about addiction. And we know that, you can have an addiction to cigarette smoking and drugs, but can you have a food addiction? And that's what this episode is all about. So stay tuned because my guest will be here and she is an expert on this subject. Okay, spot on listeners. Like I mentioned before, I brought in an expert on this whole topic of food addiction. Her name is Dr. Ashley Gearhardt. She is the professor of psychology at the University of Michigan. And she is really one of those researchers who is on top of this occurrence. And she investigates how highly processed foods can trigger food addiction. But what she created, I can't wait to ask her this. She developed the Yale Food Addictive Scale. I got to ask her all about that. So anyway, first of all, Dr. Ashley Gearhardt, welcome to Spot On.
Thank you so much for having me, Joan. I'm thrilled to chat with you today.
I know this is your topic, and I've spoken to you before about this, and you are so enthusiastic about this, and you have so much knowledge. I wish we were next to each other, that osmosis would occur from your brain to my brain.
That would be lovely.
That would be great, but it's not going to happen. Anyway, all right. So let's start from the very beginning. What makes a substance addictive?
That is such a great question. And one thing that I always kind of emphasize is that addictive substances don't really exist just in nature. Addictive substances, there's no like wine river, there's no like edible tree. It's something that humans, through our ingenuity, through our technologies, we take naturally occurring substances like some fruit or a tobacco leaf, and we refine it, we process it, we alter it. And so something that was a reinforcing substance, like a little bit of ethanol, like a little bit of nicotine, and an addictive drug, it is rapidly delivered at high doses into our body and into our brain. And we also see, in addition to kind of that rapid delivery of a high dose of something that's reinforcing, that makes your brain sit up and go, woo, many addictive drugs also include additives that amplify that drug. And a lot of them actually are about taste and smell. So if you think of, a glass of wine or a cocktail, people aren't drinking just like straight grain alcohol.
Right.
They want it to taste good. They want it to have some sugar or some hops. If you think about cigarettes, they have 4,000 different ingredients in them, and a lot of them are actually about the flavor and the taste profile of menthol and sugar and cocoa. And we know that people crave the flavor profiles that accompany the delivery of really reinforcing substances into the brain.
So that's like a double whammy.
You got it. You crave, that flavor. People get really attached to their specific brand of cigarettes. Even though all the cigarettes have nicotine, they want the flavor profile that is, that resonates with them. That's part of their history. And so when I think about, go ahead, Joan.
No, I was just going to say, and I can get that, as a dietitian and nutrition professor, that, there's like a drug in there. There's something that's addictive, and then they have the flavors. But, can food be addicted? That's really what I want to get down to, because I don't think it's like a drug,
It's not. And I think that there is, something unique about the idea of, I think when we say drug, we think of like a chemist in a lab creating this chemical substance that like will click your brain. Something like nicotine, it's just a naturally occurring substance that's an eggplant. This leaf, and it's something that when you refine it and you alter it in a way that it's delivered in cigarettes, there's nothing magical about the chemical. There's nothing magical that makes it a drug per se. It's just good at getting across the blood-brain barrier and unlocking our reward system. And so if we think of naturally occurring foods that people don't seem to eat addictively, things like a banana or, nuts, foods that have fat, sugar, these are chemical substances in our society. Our brain is designed to find those reinforcing. Our brain is designed to find sugar chemicals and, fat lipids reinforcing. But it's really only in these really processed foods that have started to dominate our food environment since about the late 1970s and 80s that we've created through human ingenuity, where we've been able to very effectively strip out the sugar and strip out the fat. So now it's in its potent, refined state. And then we combine them together in like thousands and thousands of unique combinations, and we then enhance them with flavor chemicals and somatosensory crunchy profiles. And what those foods do is they deliver those sugar and fat chemicals at a level that is higher than exists in nature, at a more rapid rate than exists in nature, and with additives that really make them be potent and pop in the way that our mouth and our brain experiences them. And so do I think that the food companies were like, yes, we want to create something that's going to be addictive? No, not necessarily, but have the products that they've created cross this threshold that they're so much more intensely and unnaturally rewarding than anything our brains really evolved to know how to manage. I would say that based on kind of the criteria we've used with things like cigarettes, which was this huge debate, whether cigarettes could really be addictive. They didn't look like other addictive substances. They were legal. People didn't get high. This can possibly be addictive, but it was killing hundreds of thousands of people every year, and people couldn't stop, even if they really wanted to, even if they knew it was killing them. And when I look at, the sort of highly processed foods that now dominate our food environment, people know they're not good for them. They know they have diabetes. They know they're having heart disease and sleep apnea. They want to cut down on them. And they find that those foods feel so irresistible. The cravings are so potent. Once they start eating them, they find they can't stop. That it's much like how we saw with addictions with cigarettes. And so I think these are trillion-dollar companies that put a lot of effort, R&D, and to research and development funds into creating foods that they say they want them to hit our bliss point. They want to maximize craveability. They want them to induce moorishness, so you eat more and more and more. Well, to me, that's all the hallmarks of how you create addictive substances.
Right. Actually, that's really very interesting what you said, because, like you said, a banana doesn't, you don't crave a banana. And, I love watermelon. We're in watermelon season right now, but you give me those gummy watermelon candies. Actually, like, don't even come near me, because I will not share with you. I'm just telling you, right? There's no sharing of those candies. And that's interesting, because when it's in the natural state, watermelon, yes. Right. But when you concentrate, it's almost like we say in the scientific community, the dose makes the poison.
100%. 100%. So think again, like an eggplant has nicotine in it, just like a cigarette has nicotine in it. But the dose of nicotine in the eggplant, no one is like, I know I can't stop eating eggplant. I eat it till I throw up because I just need my nicotine fix. Like, that's not happening. But
unless it's eggplant parmesan,
exactly,
and then maybe,
and then that's not for the nicotine; it's for the the carbs and the fat. Is that it's the dose of nicotine and the way it's delivered into the system and the way it's amplified. Even though that chemical of nicotine is the same in the eggplant versus the cigarette, it's really that man-made processed substance that is so intensely reinforcing that for some people it triggers that compulsive sensitized behavior. And so I think, when we first started doing this work, we called it food addiction. I feel like now I really focus on highly processed
Right.
food addiction. And even then there's debates, and I even go back and forth about, what's the best term for that class of foods, those foods that have unnaturally intensely high levels of refined carbohydrates like sugars and flours and starches and or fats, added fats. Like, what's the best label? I don't know. I think as a field we're still debating that. But what we see in our lab is that people are not losing control over bananas and apples and watermelon and salmon, even foods they might enjoy and find tasty. I think, for myself, there was this moment where I was like, this is what distinguishes these classes of foods. And we got to figure out the best way to really operationalize it. Is I'd had this delicious lunch, and it was like a roasted salad bowl with like hummus and delicious broccoli rabe and nuts and eggs. And as I was eating it, I was getting fuller. And the more I ate it, the less I wanted, right? I was like, oh, I'm good. I feel satiated. I feel nourished. I could not eat another bite. Please take this away. And then my husband was just craving potato chips, and he ordered a bowl of potato chips, and I could not stop shoveling them in my mouth. And the more I had one, the more I wanted more, even though it was clear that that wasn't about caloric need. It wasn't it's about that those foods, those processed foods, they induce moorishness. The more you have it, the more you want it. And I think that's what we see with addictive substances. Like if you have a great big glass of ice water when you're thirsty on a hot day, the more you drink of the water, the less you want more water. You feel good. If you have a glass of wine, you're like, I could have another glass of wine. That it's not quenching the drive. It's actually stimulating further drive for that substance.
Right. You talk about your lab, and I find this so fascinating. And you, in the intro, I talked about that you created this Yale Food Addiction Survey. Could you explain a little bit what that is, and then how? I mean, you alluded to, you found that high sugar foods or high fat, or even worse, together. Found it. So tell me about the Yale Food Addiction Survey.
My pleasure. So when I first started doing this research in kind of the mid 2000s, the world was kind of being rocked by the fact that obesity and diet-related disease and even binge eating was just skyrocketing. We were really catching up in the 2000s with the fact that since the 80s, all of these things had changed, and really why was the question. And there was this very compelling line of work, including from some of the top addiction researchers in the field, Dr. Nora Volkow, that finding that, wow, when you look at the brains of people with obesity who are reporting that they're eating more than they want to and they need to, the mechanisms in the brain of reward and craving that we see in addiction, that's what's lighting up here too. And there was this animal model work, a lot of it coming out of Princeton, Dr. Bart Hobel's lab, Dr. Nicole Avina, finding that, wow, when we're giving these rats sugar, their brains look like the brains of a rat on heroin. Like it's releasing that neurochemicals. And so in the human psychology world, we were kind of relying on obesity as just this proxy for people who might be addicted. Or we were saying, are you a carb craver? Are you a chocoholic? It was a little mishy-mashy about how we were defining it. And as we know, obesity is very multifactorial. There's so many factors that can make your BMI be over 30, some of which may have nothing to do with compulsive overeating of food. You could have medication side effects. You could have medical conditions. And so it felt like just using obesity as a proxy for this addiction wasn't great. It also was missing a lot of people who might have a body mass index in the normal weight range, but their relationship with food was nothing but normal, like that they were experiencing, that compelling urges and maybe doing things to counteract that by fasting or dieting or excessive exercise. And so we really said, okay, this is a problem we look at with all addictive substances. 90% of people drink, only about 14 to 15% actually develop an addiction to this alcohol. So why don't we use the exact same criteria we use to diagnose an addiction for every single other addictive substance under the sun?
Mhm.
And let's look at that in the context of eating, rewarding, tasty food. And so the current version of the Yale Food Addiction Scale, which really reflects how we diagnose every substance addiction, has 11 criteria. And I won't go through them all because that's boring for me to list 11 things for you. But in general, what we see is of those core signs of addiction is that people report that they lose control, that they eat more or more often than they want. Once they start going, it feels hard to stop. They're finding that they have intense, sometimes irresistible cravings, that when they try and cut down or they try and cut something out, that they've tried so many times they can't be sick, but they're finding limited success. They're finding even when they're having really negative consequences, like they know they feel sick and groggy and sluggish after they consume it, or guilty, or they have diabetes, that they're continuing to use it in the same way, even though they know it's punishing them. That they'll report withdrawal, that when they do try and cut down, they feel irritable and agitated and preoccupied and kind of depressed, and the way somebody feels when they try and give up smoking. And so we took those, same diagnostic criteria we would use to identify whether you were addicted to cigarettes or cocaine or alcohol, and we just applied it to highly rewarding foods. And so from our scale, we do kind of a symptom count of how many symptoms somebody says they're experiencing from 0 to 11. In America, the average person is experiencing 1 to 2 symptoms of addiction and their intake of these kind of highly rewarding foods. And then we also have a diagnosis, which again mimics a diagnosis for something like alcohol use disorder and alcohol addiction. And that's 2 or more symptoms in the past 12 months, plus clinically significant impairment or distress. It's really impacting your life, impacting the way you can function. And as what we see right now in adults is about 14% of adults and just a normal sample, community sample, meet that diagnostic threshold for highly processed food addiction. When we look at children, it's 12%. That's mind-boggling. We don't typically see addiction to substances in children because we protect them against alcohol and cannabis and things like that. If we look at more clinical samples, like people coming in for weight loss treatment, it's about 1 in 3 are meeting for that highly processed food addiction criteria.
Right.
And
Ashley, just to clarify, when you say highly processed, because we've done episodes on this before and spun on all foods are processed. Baby carrot is processed. A baby, you don't grow baby carrots; they from regular carrots. But we're talking when you say highly processed, these that have a lot of added sugars and added fats, sweets and treats.
That's exactly so.
Savory snacks.
Exactly. You're right. So in my lab, there's a lot of debates out there about the best term. In my lab, how we define kind of highly processed foods are foods that have a refined carbohydrate, like sugar, like white flour, like processed starch, and or added fats. And so what we've seen in our lab when we've asked people, usually what we did when we created the Yale Food Addiction Scale is we went through the literature and said, what are the sorts of foods that people say they're craving and they're binging on? And it was all the foods we just talked about, things like ice cream and, pancakes and sugary cereal and potato chips and pizza and French fries, like foods that don't exist in nature. They're intensely amplified through processing based on their reward levels. And the best way to amp up reward is amp up refined carbohydrates, amp up added fats. But we've always had those foods in mind when we've asked people to think about filling out the scale. But the next step we did is we're like, well, maybe we're missing it. Maybe people are experiencing this loss of control and irresistible cravings and continued use despite negative consequences just as often with watermelon. People love the taste of watermelon as they are with, chocolate chips. And so what we did is we did a study where we took out any priming. We didn't tell people to think of certain foods. We asked them about the symptoms in the Yale Food Addiction Scale, that behavioral profile. And then we asked them to rate what sort of foods are you most likely to experience that sort of behavior with. And what we found is when we asked people to rate that is that the foods that were at the tippy top of the list were all like highly processed foods. It wasn't just washed or cut or canned. It was, they had refined carbohydrates in them. They had added fats. That combination seems to pick, processed foods that have both refined carbohydrates and added fats. Your ice creams, your pizzas, your French fries, your chocolates. That was the top quadrant of foods that people reported this behavior with. There was a secondary quadrant of foods that seemed to be triggering people, and that was foods that were just refined carbohydrates. They didn't really have fats in them, but that was like your sodas, your gummy candy,
My
the
watermelon
watermelon gummy
gummies.
candies. That's exactly right.
Right.
Your Swedish fish that highlights, that they are a low fat food, like that there's some sort of health option. Like that sort of quadrant seemed to be really next risky. And then much lower down the scale were foods that were naturally occurring that had fat, something like steak or bacon or cheese on its own, that we had added a lot of salt to through our processing. Those foods seem to have a little bit of addictive potential, not quite as intense as those, really processed refined carb, clusters. And then at the very bottom of the list were our minimally processed foods. Even if they had high naturally occurring levels of sugar, they had, more naturally occurring levels of fat, like some nuts or, your watermelon or your strawberries or your salmon. Those foods were just not triggering addictive responses. And this really fits with our neuroscience, that when you look at sugar and fat and you put it in the mouth or even directly into the gut, it seems to release key reward and motivation neurotransmitters like dopamine, like endogenous opioids, at the same magnitude in the same regions of the brain as something like nicotine and ethanol. So it really does seem, when it comes to your brain, the power of these, highly processed, potently rewarding foods really seems to mimic the effectiveness of something like a cigarette, like an alcoholic beverage.
Actually, I've told you this story before, but what you're saying about sugar and fat together. When I was in graduate school, stressful, as you well know.
Yeah.
The more initials you have after your name, the more stress you have in life. I've learned that.
Totally.
Okay?
Yes. Lots of stress.
So anyway, when I had a bad day in graduate school, I would go home and I would ring up my two best friends, and they were Ben and Jerry. and Ben and Jerry really, when I was stressed, would just hit it and give me that, soothing reward, that dopamine release. But after a while, I said, my goodness gracious, here I'm getting a doctorate in nutrition and I'm going to Ben and Jerry's. Hello?
Yeah.
There's something wrong with this picture here. So I said, this is silliness. I'm going to start when I'm stressed. I'm going to not go home. I'm going to go for a run, and then I go home. And the run became the stress release mechanism. So how much is this? I mean, I'm getting this with the dopamine hit, but how much is this chemical or, but also habitual?
Oh, it's so both. And that's absolutely true with all addictive substances. Like you could have said Ben and Jerry's, or you could have said my good friend $2 Chuck. And I opened up my bottle of wine, and that was my buddy at the end of the day to stress relieve, right?
Excuse me, Ashley. Yeah. I think you're aging yourself. I don't think it's $2
anymore. Oh, no, that's so disappointing. Yes, I am aging myself. I must be drinking better wine now. But yes, habit, you think of the smoke break, right?
Yeah.
Habits are an essential component of addictive substances. That habit that, I do it at that certain time of day. It's a little reward for myself. It's a stress reliever, are absolutely essential factors. Now, I would caveat, like, our habits that we have with things that aren't addictive, it's a different beast. So I think I told you, Joan, too, like I'm a huge University of Michigan football fan. It makes me very nervous when I watch games. I'm incredibly unpleasant to be around. And I will, out of my nerves and out of stress, I will like pick at my nails, right? There's nothing about this nail that is going to addict me and make me just like want more nail picking, but it is this habit stress pattern. But I don't crave nail picking. However, if what I was doing was every time I watched a game, I was really stressed out and I was, pounding shots of Fireball and eating like a bunch of potato chips to stress relief, there is something about those potato chips and that alcohol that is rewarding. And so the habit can also start to can sensitize the system and make you want more and more and more out of it.
Oh,
And what
interesting.
we'll see with people is that oftentimes kind of addictions can start in a more narrow way. Like, oh, I have a glass of wine, or I have Ben and Jerry's at the end of a stressful day. But the more you use it, the more you want it. And then all of a
Mm.
sudden you're also craving that, at 3 p.m. And then, oh, on Saturdays, I put a little tipple of whiskey in my coffee and I have that donut for breakfast. Because of the substance itself and the way it can sensitize wanting systems and lead to alterations in the reward profile of your brain, it can start to hook you on it. And then it kind of broadens out in your life and starts to take on a life of its own.
Actually, talk about habits and starting these things. There was a recent CDC study of over 18,000 preschool children.
Yeah.
When they asked them, about their diet, or asked the parents about their diet over a typical week, they found that over 50% of the children didn't eat a vegetable daily, did not. 1/3 didn't eat a fruit daily.
Wow.
But more importantly, 50% of them drank a sweetened beverage at least once during the week. So when you a habit, and you're telling me about this fix and this dopamine, I'm only scared to think, if we start this early in little people, what will that look like later as an adult?
You're exactly right. So like the thing about addictive substances, or really rewarding substances, is they stamp in habits quicker and more potently. Like if it wasn't that great, it was like your brain doesn't stamp it in your brain circuitry. It takes longer to instill a habit for something that isn't that rewarding. And so it's why it's a little bit effortful for us to be like, I'm trying to eat my greens every day, right? It takes a little bit of executive functioning and willpower and kind of focus for me to make sure I'm getting in my greens every day, because the greens don't kind of stamp in this huge reward response that my brain is like, great, let's just make this a habit. Whereas if I'm, saying, oh, I'm going to eat chocolate every day, my brain's like, awesome, don't have to work hard to do that. That's stamped in.
Yeah.
And the thing is, we know that the younger the brain, the more malleable it is, and the more kind of plastic it is for habits and preferences and tendencies to be stamped in. That can be for good or for bad. It could be, if we catch it and every day you're having, that soda or that, sugary drink, and you're a little guy, that's going to stamp that in your brain. And the brain can also be plastic, that if it's switched to unsweetened, bubble water that's still kind of fizzy and exciting, or, some sort of different thing, that the plasticity of the brain of the child should also flex. But you're right, if our whole childhood, and man, we see this in our lab, that if there's something that was your whole childhood and now as an adult, you're like, oh no, like drinking, soda every day is not great for my health. I have diabetes. I'm having these heart issues. I now need to stop. You're trying to fight against these habit patterns that have been stamped in and reward memories. And it's much more challenging. And we are seeing in our lab that for people who experienced food insecurity as a child, particularly in childhood, that a lot of food insecurity, you're more reliant on these sort of cheap, convenient, highly processed, shelf-stable, potentially addictive foods to get your caloric needs. That's what's available. That's what can fit into your high-stress life. And sometimes they're available and sometimes they're not. And so there's also this kind of signal in the brain of, when it's available, eat as much as you can, hoard, grab. We are seeing that childhood food insecurity is a real risk factor, even for people who in adulthood, they're no longer food insecure. They now have enough money to get food. That experience of food scarcity combined with really rewarding food in childhood, it sets your brain up to really be sensitized to that potentially for life.
I mean, you talk about a memory being stamped into your head to go to bed hungry,
Oh, yes.
knowing that when you wake up in the morning, there's nothing there.
100%.
And I can't even imagine it. That movie keeps on rewinding in your head.
Absolutely.
On top of this. And on top of what you're alluding to, the environment that we live in.
100%.
I mean, you know, when I grew up, I grew up in a little town in New Jersey, and there was one McDonald's in the town and nothing else.
Yep.
Now you can have 2 McDonald's on a boulevard.
Oh, 100%.
And so what does that do? What is the availability to turn around and see all this all the time do for this?
Oh, it makes it. So I have to be honest, when I first started to do this work, I was doing alcohol addiction research, and I was like so interested in these parallels with the food environment, highly processed foods. I had wonderful advisors in my graduate training at Yale, one of whom, Will Corbin, is an alcohol addiction researcher. He's now at Arizona State. Kelly Brownell, obesity food policy researcher. He's now at Duke University. And really working in those 2 labs is how I was able to kind of create this work for myself in grad school, and they were so supportive. But, you know, I think Will and even myself a little bit were skeptical that food was really, you know, if you had an addictive response to food, could it really be as bad as something like alcohol or other drugs? And I have changed my tune over the course of doing this research after talking to so many people, especially people who have had actually both addictions. That's not necessarily rare, where people will transfer from one to the other, where, you know, I used to have an alcohol addiction, and then when I stopped drinking, I like started to transfer that same behavioral pattern, but now to sweets and, you know, savory foods. That was how I was coping. That's how I was dealing. And they would say, these highly processed foods are so much harder than when I had an addiction to alcohol or pills, because it's everywhere.
Right.
It's just, I'm constantly cued. I'm constantly triggered. I constantly have to eat. And so eating's part of human nature. But if you go in the current American food supply, 73% of foods are considered ultra processed.
Wow. That
is our calories. So it is a rarity to have calories available to you that are not ultra processed. And so, billboards on every corner, vending machines in every space. I go to a morning meeting, the likelihood somebody's bringing like bagels and cream cheese and a sweetened coffee for the group at, 8 a.m. when I'm tired and cranky is very high. And so this constant sense that you kind of have to be on guard, it just saps that kind of willpower that you have, that executive control, that executive functioning, that by the end of the day, often you're just so depleted. And so I always really try to emphasize to people the importance of compassion for yourself, that I think we're all beating ourselves up, that there is some sort of easy solution or answer, like, geez, our brain is in the Stone Age, right? It still thinks we're going to die of starvation. But the food technology, the food environment, it's like the Jetsons. It's like in space. It's like science fiction. It really is. And so where the mismatch here is just so potent.
Right. I'm glad you said that, actually, because I don't want people to feel bad. I want them to understand this is not their fault. And what you said, how challenging this is compared to drugs and alcohol, because you have to eat all the time, and everything is around you. So give us some hope, because I don't like to be Debbie Downer.
No, totally.
Ashley, don't be Debbie Downer on me.
No,
right?
I will not. I promise you.
So what can people do if they after listening to this episode, they say, this sounds a lot like me. What can people do to help this along?
So I am, so I do feel hope. I grew up in rural Ohio. And I do think, I always like to preface this, it's going to take both courageous kind of policy support on our change makers, on our politicians, to invest in policies that make the food environment promote health and well-being rather than profits for these trillion-dollar food companies. But that is currently what it's set up to do. And so just as we did with tobacco, where in my lifestyle, like in rural Ohio, everybody smoked everywhere. It was in restaurants, bars. There was like a vending machine right outside of my high school to get cigarettes. Like
in an airplane. I am like,
air.
We're alive. We're alive.
But one of my colleagues has the Yale Medical School cigarette delivery box where like they would be in there learning about lung cancer and everybody's smoking in the room. They'd come and deliver cigarettes so people could buy them. So things have,
Right.
we've seen this change. We've seen that with courageous action, we can save millions of lives. Through policy, through restricting marketing to kids, to changing zoning restrictions. So there isn't a McDonald's on every single. We're not living in food swamps that are just drenched in this. And as a society, we really need to push for that, and that it's not okay, especially for our children, to be so aggressively targeted. But for yourself, that's going to take work, and that's going to take us all asking for change and demanding change. But how do you navigate this while we're pushing for this change? As I mentioned, I think we know that shaming and blaming and hating yourself just makes people feel worse, and it does not inspire change.
Mm-hmm.
And, our brains are up against trillion-dollar companies that are designing these foods to induce moorishness. And so this is kind of the controversial point of this research. I don't think all foods are created equal. I even question whether some of these ultra-processed foods, which have maybe no ingredients that I know how to pronounce, are truly food in the way that something like an apple or salmon or a watermelon is. And so I personally approach really processed foods, even if they have health claims on them, like low fat food or, high in protein. If I look at that ingredient list and I can't pronounce half of what's on it, I approach that food with skepticism. It doesn't mean I never eat it. Like I definitely eat these foods sometimes, but I almost think of it more like it's a glass of wine than it should be the staple of how I'm getting my calories every day. Mm-hmm. So I do think that, trying to ensure that you're getting nourished from the food, and it's kind of real food that you would recognize, its ingredient list is something like spinach and walnut and, apple, rather than, high fructose corn syrup with Gata, blah, 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 something you can't pronounce. So, I think we have a sense that eating 3 meals, 1 or 2 snacks, eating regularly, nourishing your body with real whole food can help. And what we see is that when the body is nourished, when you aren't starving yourself as well, when you're not super famished, that seems to turn down the volume on the reward systems of your brain. If your brain isn't worried that it's starving, if it's actually getting nourished, mm-hmm. it's not as reactive to those food cues in the environment. Mm. It's not saying, go feed me. So I think where I see a lot of people make mistakes, which are completely understandable, as they're struggling, they're overeating, they're losing control, and then the next day they say, "Okay, now I'm going to only eat like 600 calories today," and they're mostly eating stuff that's ultra processed, and they're not getting nourished, and they're really hungry, and it's setting them up to fail because their brain is screaming at them.
Right.
So I think that is really important. I think knowing your own personal triggers, like in addiction, we focus so much on what are your cues, what are your triggers? As you talked about, Joan, coming home at the end of the day after a stressful day was a huge trigger. That's essential to we have people kind of journal and monitor themselves for, I just kind of lost control here. Oh, my craving is really intense right here. What triggered this? Was it a person, a place, a thing, a time of day, an emotion? Is it being on your couch? Is it having Netflix on? Mm-hmm. The more you can bring that into conscious awareness and know what your cues and triggers are, the more you can try and manage them by maybe, you don't watch TV in that room at 9 o'clock because that's always when you're triggering, you go take a bath instead. You do those kind of replacements there. You find stress is huge for me. What are healthier de-stressors that actually fit in my life so I'm less vulnerable to turning to these foods or alcohol or some other substance?
And I can't change the environment tomorrow, but I can change the environment in my home,
exactly,
in my office, in my car, wherever I am. So, you can take some control over this.
Your kind of micro environments.
Knowing again, what we just found out, and not to blame yourself and to set yourself up appropriately by eating better and snacking on healthy foods. and, making it easier for you
Exactly.
to try to minimize, that these kind of situations. So, this has just been unbelievable. I was skeptical of food addictions years ago, but as I'm learning more and more about this, and really from you, I'm really like, this makes a whole heck of a lot of sense, because I can feel it in myself when I get under those susceptible emotions, and I can see what I'm going for. I want relief. I want reward. And you just explained how these foods can provide that temporarily.
Yes,
That's
exactly.
right. And then because you're stressed, and so then you eat a whole pint of Ben and Jerry's, and then you have two problems: the original stress and the fact that you just ate a pint of Ben and Jerry's. So there we go. So we can figure that all out. So Dr. Ashley Gearhardt, I can't thank you enough about this.
Pleasure.
And I think I'm so excited that we were able to get this information out so that people could understand this and start thinking about, how this may be impacting their life. So once again, I want to thank you for being on Spot On.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me and your open-mindedness about this topic as the science emerges. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you about it.
Thanks again.